All right. Hopefully that's working as it should. So tonight we're looking at some of the same time periods that we've been looking. We've been talking about the Muslim Islamic incursion that was affecting the areas where Christianity was at the time and the effects of that. And so we're kind of moving from the Middle East area and away from North Africa, although we're still going to see the Muslims and their effect here. But we're going back into what is modern day France and looking at the Frankish Empire. Because if you'll remember, we were talking some time back about the fact that Christianity had been accepted by these Germanic tribes, especially the Franks, which was one of those Germanic tribes. And Christianity had certainly grown among those Germanic tribes. Now that was during the 5th century is when we really talked about that. And we talked about kings like Clovis. Clovis, we had mentioned, was the very first to embrace Christianity. And so, of course, they began to spread it or began to demand it at some particular times. But when we were talking about Clovis, one of the things that you need to know is that Clovis was part of a dynasty known as the Merovingian dynasty. Clovis was part of a dynasty known as the Merovingian dynasty. Now, I think that, and I never watched it, but the Da Vinci Code, whenever you see these kind of conspiracy theories about, various things that took place in the Middle Ages that, with Christianity and all these things like the Da Vinci Code, a lot of times you'll hear them talk about the Merovingians or the Carolingians and things like that. But there actually were dynasties known as those, and Clovis was a part of the Merovingian dynasty. Now, when we come into the 6th century, the Merovingian dynasty begins to slowly lose power among the Frankish people. And the reason is because the nobility among the Frankish people was growing in power. And there are various reasons for this. We won't go into all that. So you had the king, and then you had obviously nobles that were over him, over various regions under him, and they would have different tracts of land that they owned. And so what again began to happen is the king begins to lose power and the nobles begin to gain power. And as that happens, the overall power of the king just gets less and less. By 630, the Merovingian kings had no practical authority outside of their own royal lands. They had no practical authority outside of their own royal land. So the king had his own lands that belonged to him, and then a greater kingdom where nobles owned the land. So he basically just becomes one among the other nobles, if you'll kind of look at it in that particular way. But even there, in his own lands, he began to lose power to the mayors of that particular land because, and the way that this was structured is that you would have the king and then you would have a mayor that was kind of over his palace. And the mayor was kind of like, the second in command who would kind of take care of things. And as the king began to lose power, even in his own lands, the mayor began to gain in power and became something of like a prime minister. So think of something of like modern day English monarchy. You have the king as a figurehead, and then you have the prime minister who's actually the head of or runs the government. So these mayors become very much like that, with like a prime minister.
Was this Merovingian dynasty, was this mostly in France now?
Yes. This is among the. I mean, there is no France as we know it today, but it was in that area, and it was certainly the Frankish Empire. So the office of mayor in the Merovingian dynasty eventually became hereditary, just like the king's dynasty. Okay? And the family that it belongs to, they are the Carolingian family. Carolingian family. And the first hereditary mayor of the Carolingian family is known as Pepin of Laudon. Laudon. Pepin of Laudon. Now, just be prepared. We're going to run into another Pepin. All right? But this is the very first of the Carolingian line. Pepin of Laudon. He dies in 639, but he's the first mayor of that Carolingian family. Pepin and those that come after him as successors first sought to restore the authority and prestige of the Merovingian monarchy. They first sought to restore the authority and prestige of the Merovingian monarchy. Now that seems real nice of them to do that, but in fact it was not out of the goodness of their heart that they were doing that. They actually did this in order that their own power would increase. If the king has more power, then certainly his prime minister is going to have more power in the empire. So they're wanting their power to increase. In order for that to happen, they've got to get the king's power to increase over the nobility. And so one of the ways, or at least the way that it affects Christian history, that they tried to do that was by Christianizing the pagan tribes that were in the empire. These pagan tribes in what is now the Netherlands and Germany, specifically. Trying to Christianize the pagan tribes in what is now the Netherlands and Germany.
How did they Christianize?
They declared them a Christian.
Okay. Most of it, we're going to talk about that. Some of it was legitimate. So we'll just
Evangelizing.
yes, and for our folks on that listen to this, the question was, how did they become Christianized? And the answer to that is there was some evangelism that took place, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But some of these Germanic tribes, pagan tribes, were like the Frisians, the Hessians, the Saxons. You've heard of some of those folks before. And the idea was that if these Germanic tribes became Christian, then they would no longer be as rebellious, because they were quite rebellious and continued to be in the future. But the thought was that if they were under the control of the church instead of just tribal leaders, then the Carolingians could control them through the power of the church. Because there was certainly a connection between the Frankish emperors and the papacy. So that was the idea. Charles Martel, who we've talked about before, remember Charles Martel was the leader of the Franks that went and defeated the Muslim armies at Tours. He gave strong support for English missionaries to go to these Germanic tribes in order to share the gospel with them. He was certainly one of those who was a strong supporter of that. And there are two prominent English missionaries I want to mention that went to these Germanic tribes to evangelize, and they were English missionaries. The first of the missionaries that I want to talk about is a man named Willibrord. Willibrord. I looked up how you pronounce that. That's the best I can do. Okay? Yeah, you can call him Willie. Willibrord was from Northumbria in the Angle Kingdom, and he started out as a student in Ireland. And so you may remember some of the things that we talked about as far as the Irish. And in 690, he led a group of 12 Irish missionaries. So he was the leader. He had 12 Irish missionaries. And if you remember from what we talked about with the Irish, that was a pattern that the Irish used. They would send 13 out, one to lead, 12 missionaries under them, and they would go out to these various areas, obviously based on Jesus and the apostles. And so they went to the Netherlands in order to preach to the Frisian people. And in fact, Willibrord had many people who converted under the preaching of he and those missionaries that were under him. And so he was quite successful. The second missionary is Winfrid. Winfrid. But Winfrid is not known in history as Winfrid. He's known in history by his Latin name, Boniface. Boniface. And Boniface means doer of good. Doer of good. And Boniface certainly tried to do that. He was from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in Wessex in England. And he spent the majority of his childhood in a monastery. He grew up, and this was not something that was totally uncommon at the time for parents to take their children to the monastery and for them to grow up in the monastery. Again, different times, different customs. As an adult, he first worked under Willibrord in the Netherlands among the Frisians. And he was one of those, because the 12 that were under Willibrord would kind of rotate out. They weren't all the same throughout the entire time. And Boniface was one of those that worked under him. But a few years later, in 1718, I think it was only 2 years, I think he maybe started working with Willibrord at like 716, something like that. In 718, he begins a new work among the Hessians and the Thuringians in central Germany. So what he does is he starts by establishing many monasteries. He established many monasteries. These would obviously be places where the message of Christ could go out from these various monasteries. And they included a very famous abbey in Fulda, which is in central Germany, and you can go to that monastery today. For about 300 years, those monasteries were the centers of religion and culture in that German area. So 3 centuries later, they were still very, very established and working in a very central way there in central Germany. One of the things that Boniface was known for was upholding papal authority wherever he preached. In other words, he preached to people, you need to listen to the Pope, generally speaking. Okay? And because of that, in 723, Pope Gregory II ordained Boniface as a special missionary bishop. Now, the interesting thing about this is that bishops were always connected to a church until Boniface. Because he's elected as a special missionary bishop, he's not connected to a particular church. In 732, which is 9 years later, Pope Gregory III, so the next pope, raised him to the rank of missionary archbishop. So now he has a superior rank there within the Catholic Church. And eventually the next pope, Pope Zacharias, appointed Boniface Archbishop of Mons in western central Germany in 743. So Boniface is obviously, rising through the ranks there. Boniface did certainly lots of other things. I would encourage you to look at some of his life. It is interesting. But he did die as a martyr. In 754, he was murdered by Frisian pagans. And because of that, the church gave him the title Apostle to the Germans. Apostle to the Germans. And so he did give his life trying to share Christ with other people. Certainly Boniface is credited with bringing many Germans out of paganism and into Christendom. When Charles Martel died in 741, he had 2 sons named Carloman and Pepin. There we go. I told you there was another Pepin coming. There's Pepin number 2. Carloman and Pepin, and they ruled as mayors in the palace there. They ruled as mayors in Charles Martel's place. Carloman was in one of the king's palaces, and Pepin was in another of the king's palaces. So they kind of split it in that particular way. You would think that maybe that would bring some animosity between the 2 brothers, which typically did happen. In this particular case, Carloman and Pepin, who had both grown up in monasteries where monks raised them, they both had great concern for the church. And when they first start, they come together and they ask Boniface if he would help them to reform the Frankish church. And they want a Boniface to be the Pope's representative. And certainly, they know in doing this is going to strengthen the relationship between the Franks and the Pope. Remember, the Pope's down in Italy, generally under having his own lands, but he's kind of surrounded by the Lombards, another Germanic tribe that's down there. And this is a way that the Franks can strengthen their relationship with the Pope. And those reforms are started, and they're completed fairly quickly. And when they're finished, Carloman decides to become a monk. And he leaves the kingdom in the hands of his brother Pepin, who is mayor under the Merovingian king. The Merovingian king is King Childeric III, and he is the last king of the Merovingian line. Pepin, as again I think you could guess, desired to be king since he was already the real power in the Frankish Empire. So he has an interesting way of moving into the position of king. What he does is he sends a letter to the Pope, who was Pope Zacharias at this time, and he asks Zacharias a question. In regard to the kings of the Franks, who no longer possess the royal power, is this state of things proper? So basically what he asks is, if the king's not really in charge, shouldn't the person who's truly in charge be the king? He just poses this question. Now, Pope Zacharias at the time was being pressed militarily by the Lombards. They were encroaching on papal lands and pushing towards Rome and that sort of thing. And so Pope Zacharias needed some help. And he saw in this question an opportunity to align with the Franks himself for his own help. And so Pope Zacharias declares that it is only right for the actual wielder of power to be king. Now, he doesn't say, Pepin, you're supposed to be king. He just says that the actual wielder of power should be king. And this gives Pepin his opportunity. With the backing of the church, Pepin deposed Childeric III, and Boniface, acting as the Pope's representative, crowned Pepin as king of the Franks. And Pepin becomes the first Carolingian king. So that's how you have the transition from the Merovingians to the Carolingians. Now, this was the very first time that the Pope claimed that his apostolic ministry gave him the right to sanction the dethroning of one king and the establishing of another. So, what do you think this does to papal power? It grows because now he's naming kings. So if you have a king and you have a pope, who has superior power? It certainly becomes a question, doesn't it? I mean, generally in the past you would say, well, the church has ecclesiastical power, power over the church, and the king has political power or civil power. He has power over the state. But now you have a blending of that. Now it could be claimed that the Pope has power over the civil authorities as well. So you begin to have something of a struggle there. Definitely, when it comes to the Carolingian family, this means that that family owes its legal authority to the Pope, who gave them the authority to become kings. Pope Zacharias' successor, Pope Stephen II, ran into a similar problem that Zacharias had run into, in that Pepin, being crowned the king of the Franks, comes down, saves Pope Zacharias, and the papal lands, pushes back the Lombards, all good. That's what he was supposed to do, and then goes back to France. When he does, a few years pass, there's a new pope, Pope Stephen II. Guess what the Lombards do? They just start moving back into papal lands again. So what happens is that Stephen II, the Pope, flees Rome because the Lombards are attacking the city, and he goes to France and calls on the mercy of Pepin to help him. In order to strengthen the ties between the papacy and France, they're always trying to do this. They're always trying to strengthen the relationship. And of course, you can see that the Franks are trying to get power through the Pope, and the Pope's trying to get power through the Franks and other kingdoms as well. But what Pope Stephen II does is Pope Stephen II crowned Pepin a second time as king in 754. But he does it this time because he's in need, he needs power, and so this gives at least a little power back to the king of the Franks, because now it's the Pope who's pleading on behalf of the papal lands to the Frankish king. In return, Pepin invades Italy. He forces the Lombards to withdraw from Rome and to not attack it again. However, 2 years later, the Lombards attack Rome again. This time Pepin comes back in, and he inflicts a massive military defeat on the Lombards, and he basically just takes over the Lombards and takes over much of their territory. Certainly that territory that was in northern Italy that surrounded the papal lands. Now what this does, of course, is it widens the Frankish kingdom, right? So now the Frankish kingdom goes all the way down into Italy, all the way down just north of Rome, where the papal lands start. Pepin, being the gracious king that he is, I'm just kidding. He wants to strengthen ties with the papacy. He gives the cities of the Lombards that were in a lot of that area north of Rome to Pope Stephen and the church. And this is called the donation of Pepin. It's known in history as the donation of Pepin. And what it does is it creates papal states throughout northern Italy. So it grows the papal lands. Now they have kind of various states that are there. Much of northern Italy is still owned by the Franks, but he does give some of that land north of Rome, to the church in order to have. Now, you know that Vatican City today is a country. It's the smallest country in the world. It's really a city within the city of Rome, but it is actually papal land. You can kind of see how all this came about. Now, obviously the land has shrunk a great deal, but the Pope is not only the leader of the church today, but is also a ruler over Vatican City. He is a civil leader as well. So you're seeing that here. One of the things that Pepin did is he gives the city of Ravenna over to the Pope. And the reason that this is interesting is because Ravenna was actually under the control of the Byzantine Empire. So the Eastern Roman Empire, which is still in existence. So in their conquest of the Lombards, they just go a little bit further and they capture Ravenna, which is not owned by the Lombards, but is owned by the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as it's known now. And as you can imagine, this didn't go over well with Constantine V, who was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Obviously, he objects. You know what Pepin does? He just ignores it. And he gives it to the Pope. Constantine V doesn't really have the resources in order to take it back, nor the will to do that. But what it does is it drives a wedge, certainly between the Frankish Empire and the Byzantine Empire, which there was certainly a growing animosity taking place there. So again, this has taking over of Ravenna, giving it to the Pope. This has several impacts. First, it severed ties between the papacy and the Eastern Church. It severed ties between the papacy and the Eastern Church. And of course, you can see how this happened because if the Pope accepts Ravenna as a part of its land, the Byzantine Empire is going to be mad not only at Pepin, but also at the Pope. They're going to say, you can't take over that land, that's our land. Pepin the Pope, Stephen II, just says, hey, well, you know, we were given the land, so we're just going to keep it. So obviously, it drives a wedge there. Now, there is, and we'll talk about it when we get to it, but there's a formal schism between the Western Church and the Eastern Church that happens in 1054. And so we'll talk about that. But practically speaking, it's really this that divides the Eastern Church from the Western Church, practically speaking. It's really in 1054 that you get the official Roman Catholic Church under the name that it has today, because there was an official split that took place. I mean, they you know, again, we'll talk about how that worked out. And then you had the Eastern Orthodox Church. But again, practically, this is when that takes place. And second, this action, really the whole action of the Franks coming down to help, it cemented the bond between the Franks and the papacy. There was certainly a strong bond at that time, and no longer did the papacy look to the Byzantine emperors as the center of diplomacy and the spiritual world. They stopped looking to Constantinople. Now the focus becomes a central focus ecclesiastically. As far as the church is concerned, the focus just is on Rome, and politically looks to the Frankish Empire. So it doesn't look east anymore. Now it's looking west. And then third, this gives the papacy a vast independent state in central and northern Italy, and the popes would now be secular rulers as well as spiritual rulers. They would be secular rulers as well as spiritual rulers. And this has an effect on the church, as we're going to see, because they become secular rulers at this point as well, in a much larger fashion. It was not uncommon for future popes to be so absorbed with political matters that they basically ignore spiritual matters. They stop looking theologically, they stop doing pastoral work. It's all about the secular state. So there were certainly popes where that happened. Now, interestingly enough, it's at this time, in the middle of the 8th century, a document known as the Donation of Constantine appeared. It appeared. I'm doing scare quotes, okay? All right. This was a letter that was claimed to have been written by Constantine the Great, like Constantine the Great from the 300s, from the 4th century, to Pope Sylvester I at that time. And the story behind the letter was that Constantine had contracted leprosy. In actuality, we have no record of him contracting leprosy, but this is the story. He contracted leprosy, and Pope Sylvester came and miraculously healed Constantine. And in gratitude, Constantine wrote a letter to Sylvester where he acknowledged that the Pope was superior to the emperor and granted him the right to govern the city of Rome as well as all imperial territory in Italy and in the West to the Pope. So gives him authority over that Western empire. Now, where can you imagine this document known as the Donation of Constantine came from? Do you think it was legitimate? Well, no, absolutely not. It took a while for it to be proved a forgery, but it later was. It was shown to be a forgery in 1440. But you'll see that though it was proved to be a forgery in 1440, that means for 700 years, popes used this fake letter in order to back up their claim to papal superiority over rulers and the right to rule over those lands.
Worked pretty good, didn't it?
It worked fairly well. It did.
Even though it was shown to be forgery, it probably was still believed by a lot of people.
Oh, yes. You mean even after it was proved a forgery? Yes, absolutely. It stopped being used, and a lot of it by 1440 was moving more into the political realm. That was because the papacy was losing power at that particular time, and so there was more political power that was taking place because that's right on the edge of the Reformation, as we're going to see, and so it really has a lot to do with the loss of papal power at that time, taking place. That it becomes a useless document, even though people would have argued its legitimacy. It becomes somewhat useless because, what are the kings going to say? No, it's a forgery. They're not going to want to hold to that at all. So you have this continual battle that's going to go throughout the Middle Ages, back and forth. But yeah, there were a lot of people who I'm sure, and especially within the church, who wanted to continue to say that it was legitimate. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, this is a good place for us to stop, but I do want us to think, as far as our notes are concerned, but just stop and think here about how far we've come. One of the things that you see here, or let me just ask you, what are some of the differences that you're seeing between what we're talking about now as far as the church and what we saw in like the first 3 or 4 centuries?
Authority, different types of authority. You have popes, kings, emperors,
Yeah, certainly.
related to the church.
Yeah. There's different. There's certainly greater authority with the bishops. We've seen that rise. With Rome now, you're definitely seeing a lot of authority with Rome, and then you're seeing some relationship issues that are definite ties between the church and the civil authorities that are greater than we ever saw in the first 3 or 4 centuries.
There's sure a lot less influence on the Bible and spiritual to the people about salvation or whatever. It's more about a worldly thing.
Yeah, you do see it. I think that there are some good missionaries. I think that even though you have people like Boniface and Willibrord and others who are going, and certainly Boniface speaking to the authority of the papacy. That wasn't all he was doing. There were a lot of people that they helped. They were preaching the scriptures. I think that I'm sure were people who were saved. But
Planting churches or...
yeah, okay, so that's another one. One of the things is the message is becoming convoluted. It's beginning to be morphed into not just the gospel, but they're preaching the church, and not preaching the starting of the importance of a church, but they're preaching for all basic purposes the Roman Catholic Church, and so that's a big change. Now again, I hope we would say that the church should be a focal part of Christianity because it's the place where, it is the people gathering together in order to worship God. And it is from the church that there's authority to then go out. But these are two separate things here. We're talking about something of a worldly entity as opposed to Christ's church or the local church that we would emphasize.
Putting emphasis on the organization and not the message.
Yes. And again, this is not local churches. This is the church that encompasses many, all the churches, which is a different concept than again we would have for the most part. Now, the other thing is oftentimes you've seen instead of starting churches, they're starting monasteries. Now, oftentimes you would then eventually have a church that was connected to a monastery, but we would think very differently. We would start a church, and then from the church, the Christians would then go out. They start a monastery where they can train monks or bring monks, and then the monks go out, and then eventually you have a church. So a different system. But I think that ours is more of a biblical system. Starting churches is actually what we see in the New Testament. You don't see the starting of monasteries, but that's certainly a change.
In starting churches in Christianity, you're dealing with marriage and children and families, and monasteries, no, none of that.
Right.
Completely different arrangement.
Right.
Repeat that because they can't hear it.
Yeah, okay, so Al said that with monasteries, you don't have some of those central ideas that we have in the church, which is, the building around ideas like the family and the building of the family and children and that sort of thing. Obviously, with monasteries, you've typically got celibacy that's taking place, and so, the connection that you would have in families, and then the growth of those families within the church, like the church family, would be also something that you didn't have nearly as much. you would have more of church territories. So the monk would kind of go out and minister to the people in the territory. You didn't have as much of the gathering together. You did have that. I'm not saying you didn't have that, but it was more of the monks going out than the people coming to the church and then going out. So you had that. Yeah, I mean, as far as like the growth of theology and that sort of thing, you're not seeing that as much, although we're going to get into some theological issues that are dealt with at this time. So yeah, lots of changes that have taken place. And again, this is one of the arguments I think we ought to make with the Roman Catholic Church as well as the Eastern Orthodox Church, where they say, well, we have a church that goes all the way back to the first century. I think we need to make the argument, yes, but your church does not look like the first century church. And although our church looks like a 21st century church, we try as much as we can in the 21st century to worship and to focus on the things that were focused on in the first century. Obviously, you're always going to have societal things that took place. And you see this in the book of Acts. Societal things that different cultures do things a little bit different. But the focus is always, on the Lord, on Christ, what He's done, that sort of thing. So, lots of changes. All right. Well, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, just thank you that we can be here tonight. Thank you that we can look at these things, continue to help us to understand them and to grow and to see the differences. And again, Lord, the things that they do well and the things that they don't. Just teach us those things to be able to understand them and understand more about what you have for us. Lead us as we go. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.